Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. For those of you that this is your first time tuning in, Coffee with Coker is a healthcare business podcast published by the Coker Group. And we talk about solutions helping healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry. My name is Mark Reiboldt, and I'm the host. And today we have another great episode, and this is an episode that I've been looking forward to doing for a while. We have two great guests that you'll hear a little bit more about them, but today we had Max Reiboldt, who's the CEO and president of the Coker Group, and we also had Michael Barry, who's a partner here in Atlanta at Arnall Golden Gregory. And between Max and Michael, they have worked on, I would say, for many years on a wide range of scenarios involving hospitals and physicians engaging in alignment transactions. And today's topic is actually called the top lessons learned from first to second generation transactions. So what we're talking about is we've seen for the last number of years a number of different types of transaction alignment models and various types of deals and arrangements that have emerged and evolved between hospitals and physicians. And many of them now are getting to that point where they're evolving from that initial term or the initial kind of iteration of that arrangement, and they're going into what we call the second generation. And so this discussion really focuses on things to think about and look out for, both from the hospital's perspective as well as from the physician's standpoint, as to how can we make sure these second generation deals are set up in the optimal manner, and some of the pitfalls we can potentially avoid, and whether it's from mistakes we learned or just things we observed through the last few years of those initial versions. So I think it's extremely relevant and a very productive conversation, as I know many physicians and hospitals are going through this type of scenario, or they will be in the very near future. So I think it's very pertinent. This was actually based on, or emerged from a presentation that Max and Michael did at the American Health Lawyers Association meeting back in Nashville in May of this year. And it got a lot of great feedback and a lot of questions came up. So we thought that would be a good idea. Not only is it a relevant topic, but we thought it'd be a good idea to maybe continue the discussion a little bit further so that we could drill down on some of those things where we realize that there's some specific questions or issues that people are dealing with as it relates to this topic, and also just kind of provide a little bit more detail on some of those things that we weren't able to cover, or that Max and Michael weren't able to go into a lot of detail on during the actual presentation. We will make that presentation available as well as any other reference material in the show notes. So you can find that on the website, coffeewithcoker.com. And so you can find the post that has a link to this episode as well as any of the supporting materials. So if you want to get more detail or review any of the kind of supporting information that goes into this from the presentation, then please do so there. You can also reach out to us and we can provide it for you directly. But we wanted to cover, or at least continue the discussion, so we don't cover every point of the presentation in detail. So just know that background is available if you need it. And if you have any questions, we welcome reaching out to us. You can reach out to Michael and Max directly. We'll make sure their contact information, where to find them, is available. But we thank you all for listening. Please continue to follow us. Again, you can find out every episode at coffeewithcoker.com. You can download and subscribe on all the major podcast platforms. And you can find us on social media, on Twitter at Coker Group, and LinkedIn as well. And just search for Coker Group there, and you can find all of this content. So once again, we thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy this conversation with Max and Michael. We're going to jump right into the discussion here, but we'll start off by introducing our guests. So we have two guests we've been looking forward to having on the podcast now for months, really. So this has been in the works for a while, but I want to introduce first Max Reiboldt, who's the CEO and president of Coker Group, and Michael Barry, who's a partner at Arnall Golden Gregory here in Atlanta. First of all, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you. As I mentioned in the intro, we're talking today about lessons learned from first to second generation transactions, physician hospital alignment transactions. And we'll dive into that in a second. Before we do that, though, I'll have each of you maybe give us kind of the quick background of, specialty areas and kind of typical things you cover with your clients. Obviously, Michael, you from the legal perspective, and Max from the consulting perspective. But Michael, maybe just give us a quick background.
Sure, Mark. Thank you very much. Happy to be here today. As you noted, I'm a partner with Arnall Golden Gregory with offices here in Atlanta and in Washington, D.C. I co-chair our hospitals, health systems, and other institutional providers practice, where we have more than 30 attorneys throughout our offices specializing in providing healthcare regulatory, corporate, and litigation expertise to our clients throughout the nation. I spend most of my time in the transactional and regulatory space, and a lot of time working with institutional clients as they walk toward this second generation set of physician employment, physician compensation issue.
Yeah, no, I feel like I see you everywhere. I don't think there's a lot of hospital physician deals, at least where around here that I encounter, where you don't have a little bit of involvement. So
it's been very interesting to watch the growth of that industry and to watch it change and mature a little bit.
Indeed. Max?
Thank you, Mark. And Michael, it's a real honor to be on the same program with you. I think we've known each other for probably more years than we want to either one of us admit, because it'll indicate how long we've been in the business. But be that as it may, it's a real honor to be here and to talk about this subject. My role at Coker Group has morphed and evolved over the years as the industry has, and the transactional side has as well. And so I focus more so on transactional activities between medical providers, and that could be physician to physician, certainly largely physician to hospital. And we have the honor to work with attorneys all over the country, but in particular have really valued our relationship with AGG and with Michael specifically. And this subject that we're about to embark upon today in our discussion is really something that I think both of us are confronted with, and our clients literally every day. And this question of how we move from a first to second generation transaction. So we're looking forward to having this discussion today.
Absolutely. And we'll jump right in. I will just reiterate, as I mentioned in the intro, this was actually, this topic or presentation developed from a joint presentation that the two of you did back at the American Health Lawyers Association meeting, I think back in May in Nashville. And so, again, as I mentioned, we'll have those slides available in the show notes and on the post on the website for this episode, because there is a lot of content here on this topic, and there were a lot of slides, and so we're going to try to boil this down as much as possible. But I think it's helpful to just, if nothing else, tee up some of the high level points, and then we can drill down further into some follow-up discussion, and obviously through the slides and the content there. So, but with that, I guess as we jump in, I think first things first, let's just start by explaining, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we say first to second generation transactions? And then maybe as we do that, provide a little bit of background on some of the trends that have, driven hospital physician transactions and kind of gotten us to where we are today. Does that make sense?
Sure. I'll jump in, and Michael, I want you to certainly embellish what I say. I would say the way I might explain first to second generation definition is a couple of years ago we did a white paper, and somebody came up with the title moving from first to second generation transactions, is this alignment Armageddon? In that context, we have a lot of questions, no matter who we might be helping, whether it's the physicians or the hospitals, of saying, okay, how is this going to change our relationship when our initial contract expires? And what are the terms and conditions from everything from economic to non-economic? So essentially, that's what we're talking about, is the second deals, as it were. Sometimes they're the third or the fourth even. And Michael, I know you've done hundreds of these with all types of specialties and providers, but from a legal perspective, I'd personally be interested in hearing more about how you pursue these and what your thoughts are.
Thanks, Max. I think one of the things that's interesting is we move from a first generation to a second generation is, I think, X number of years ago, and it varies depending upon where you are in the country. Because I think this has happened in different sorts of waves and different sort of waves associated with different specialties. We've seen a move from one-offs or each employment arrangement being very different with each hospital system to, I think, what is now in a second generation, a much more uniform type of approach in addressing what does the employment relationship look like. And I think that has evolved as a result of physicians becoming more comfortable with being employees with health systems, and health systems becoming more comfortable and also learning how to implement their physicians as more as employees and as partners in the delivery of care. I think also in this second generation, we also see other influencers out there in the marketplace. So, and what I mean by that is we see private equity groups who I think are influencing the marketplace in terms of which specialties may not be employed by hospitals, but may have transactions with other sort of parties out in the marketplace to bring more care to a certain area. We're also seeing mega groups, and so their relationships, if they roll out of an employment relationship with a hospital into a mega group relationship, that I think is part of this second generation shift. That there's not a one size fits all, but we're certainly seeing some degree of uniformity that happens among hospital and physician employment arrangements going forward.
Yeah, I think it's interesting there because unlike, if you look at kind of your traditional merger acquisition scenario, that type of transaction, it's kind of a marriage, a permanent marriage, right? And it's not necessarily going to have a timeline attached to it or a definitive timeline, and it's really not intended to be broken up, or at least that's the idea. A lot of hospital physician deals, though, are very different in that there is a specific timeline. Technically, yeah, it's a marriage, but it's almost kind of a loose affiliation marriage in some cases. Even in employment arrangements, the level of actual alignment and integration can vary. And so I think that is interesting in that, whether the term is 3 years, 4 or 5, 7, whatever it may be, you're still looking at some point in time where you're either going to renew this thing or you're going some other alternative, whatever that may look like. So I feel like, and it seems like that's probably a little easier or makes sense to go ahead and start thinking about that earlier as opposed to be like, oh, wow, our arrangement's about to up for expiration or renewal in the next couple of months. We better scramble.
And Mark, one thing that I think we're seeing in the second generation versus the first is that it's less of a land grab, if you will.
Yeah.
So if you think back 10 years ago, perhaps in some marketplaces, it was much more of a land grab. You wanted to be the first party in. And I think the relationships have evolved. Parties have decided what they can and can't do from an operational perspective and from a legal perspective. Mm-hmm. Some things just don't fit anymore. And so there's not that rush to be the very first to do something. Now I think it's a much more deliberative process, if you wish. I think it's good for everyone in the system.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I know in terms of some of the overarching trends, obviously, I think the Affordable Care Act has influenced this a good bit. We know kind of the population dynamics with the aging population and expenditures, some of those kind of more traditional drivers. One of the things we talk about a lot here, though, that I think you can't talk about second-generation alignment deals without incorporating this is the whole value-based reimbursement discussion. So maybe just talk for a minute, and maybe we'll drill down a little bit further in as we get into some of the top lessons. But speak to kind of how the role that value-based care, value-based reimbursement is starting to play as we're seeing some of these new structures evolve.
Yeah, I'll jump in first here, and I definitely want to hear Michael's perspective. But the way I look at it, in particular, the compensation structure, which is a rather important part of any of these deals, first or second or whatever generation, will trail the reimbursement structure within the organization or the relationship. And in some of the first generation deals, and rightfully so, we really focused on almost totally some form of base compensation and then an incentive that was almost totally tied to productivity. in many cases individual productivity, and not surprisingly, based on a work RVU derivative. And those are still very much in play because we still have, for the most part, in most places, a largely fee-for-volume, as we call it, fee-for-service reimbursement system. But as the paradigm starts to change with MACRA and even some of the bundles that are coming down and so forth from not only the government but the private payers, the second generation plans, and to your point, Mark, on value-based reimbursement are starting to need to have a reflection within those renewed contracts where it's responsive to the new form, however small it might be, of reimbursement. Now, I know that creates a lot of legal challenges potentially because we're still trying to stay, as I always say, within the white lines of legality. So, Michael, I'm going to throw the ball over to you to comment.
Thanks, Max. I think that as healthcare evolves, it becomes increasingly important for everyone to be rowing in the same direction, if you will. And so to your point that the compensation is going to follow reimbursement, there's a little bit of a lag there, but it's certainly something that we're seeing more and more of in terms of putting employment agreements together with systems. I think from a legal perspective, a very basic challenge is, since there is that lag and there's a question of how are we measuring quality, and the fact that it may change on a very frequent basis over a 3-year term, for example, how do you provide enough flexibility within the agreements in order to accommodate that sort of growth while at the same time giving everybody some degree of comfort that the compensation model is going to be tied together with the level of work, the level of teamwork that the parties are putting in together.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Michael. And so as we look at MACRA, for instance, well, as you said, or we've kind of always talked about around here, we've had a number of podcasts we're talking about value-based reimbursement and kind of other trends in that direction. And I know you focus, monitor kind of on the policy end a lot as well. So I think we all can agree it's not going to happen overnight, meaning this shift from volume or fee for volume, as you said, is not going to become all of a sudden fee for value or whatever kind of interpretation you can make on value-based reimbursement overnight. Michael, if you can just comment briefly on MACRA and specifically as to whether or not you think that is going to be significant in pushing us further down that path a little bit, or is it kind of like, we'll just kind of all wait to see and maybe we'll take a step forward, 2 steps back, kind of typical process that we've seen in the past? What are your thoughts?
I think we're probably going to continue to see that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, just because I think that's the evolution of healthcare. No one has a crystal ball to be able to tell exactly what it's going to look like a year down the road, 3 years down the road. There's going to be constant evolution. But, I think that if you look at, we're going to be measuring quality, we're going to be measuring resource use, practice improvement, taking all of the information that we gather and pulling that together to deliver more efficient and better care. All those measures are going to continue to evolve and change.
Yeah.
It's not something that we found the absolute solution for right now.
Well, and to that point, we're still dealing with that question of how do we measure? How do we quantify? How do we, track that data and having the systems to be able to do that? So just functionally doing it, I guess we're still slowly moving that direction.
And if we're looking at a long-term relationship where you understand both as employer and employee that what represents the top 10% of excellence today will become the standard. I mean, that's the objective, is that today's excellence will become tomorrow's standard, and we'll find a new level of excellence. And so it's a constant evolution that from a legal perspective, we see that the documentation's got to be able to support. Yeah. Otherwise, you run into a log jam at some point down the road where the whole thing can fall apart.
Yeah, good point. Well, since we kind of went down this path a little bit, you guys started talking a little bit on the fair market value type considerations and compensation. I definitely think we have to, if we're talking about any sort of alignment type discussion and specifically looking at second generation alignment deals, we can't have that discussion without talking about some of the legal compliance considerations. And so, Michael, maybe since, being the resident legal counsel here today, maybe just speak to that if you can, and we'll try to tie in the whole fair market value, Stark law, anti-kickback, those types of considerations as well.
Yeah, sure. Let me let me try to boil it down to just a very high-level comment, which is healthcare regulatory issues and requirements have been around for a long time. They continue to evolve. Unfortunately, they often lag the policy. Having said that, I think we're probably on the path. The recent number I saw was $700 million in penalties and recoveries. We're moving toward $1 billion. So it's expensive and difficult to stay within the lines that we all must stay within. Having said that, there's also much more thorough and clear guidance with regard to physician-hospital employment relationships and other relationships than we had, I think, in the first generation. What does that mean going forward? I think that we now have, if you look back 10 years, 5 years, the challenge of, well, what was commercially reasonable? How was that going to be viewed? How do you balance that with fair market value? You fast forward to where we are today, and I think you've got much more clarity with regard to how you answer that question of what is commercially reasonable. And both parties now are more adept, I think, at answering the why. Why are we doing this transaction? Why is the compensation level set the way that it is? And I think that's a positive thing for both parties going forward.
Do you think, Michael, they're just doing a better job of that, or is the case actually clear? Does that make sense?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Because again, if you look back to what was a land grab, maybe there wasn't enough time to put together the absolute case study, and it was a great unknown. You didn't know what the relationship would look like, but we knew that it would work better and provide better care. We look to where we are now, 5-10 years later. We know that the relationship does provide better care. We know exactly what it takes in order for the physician to put the work in, not only laying hands on the patients, but also helping to manage a service line, for example. So I think with the experience we've gotten, we have a much better ability to answer the questions of, well, is this commercially reasonable?
I would add that we've learned unfortunately, from a lot of very costly penalties and experiences, court cases and fines that have been exercised on organizations that, again, will remain nameless for this discussion, but we all know of the various cases that are public and the penalties that have been exerted. So I think we've learned from our past mistakes, if you want to call them that the government has invoked, and so I'm actually working on another presentation. I'm basically, I haven't got the exact title down, but I'm basically calling it a walk down memory lane over the last 30 years of putting these deals together. And the real question that I'm trying to ask and answer is, do we have more regulatory constraints and restrictions? Are we under more scrutiny today? Because the laws haven't necessarily changed. I realize they've been updated and some have, but are we under more scrutiny today than we were 20, 30 years ago? I can remember some of the deals that were done in the 90s, the early 90s in particular, with that today, there's no way that we would touch them, and I'm sure you wouldn't either from a legal perspective. They were high. They were high values, high amounts up front, compensation that was all over the charts and had no relevance to commercially reasonable. I'm not sure that term was even used back then. But I'm seeing a lot more of that today, and I guess we're learning from our mistakes. But what's your thoughts?
I think if we look back 10, 20 years ago, maybe we didn't know what we didn't know. Yeah. I say we, the global we, everybody in the industry, because the industry was changing. Reimbursement was different. Cost structure was different than it is today. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely that evolution associated with the transactions needing to be not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from a commercial perspective, mm-hmm. one where your community will look at it and say, absolutely, that's a transaction that needs to be done, and it makes sense. While the laws have evolved, I think we have a lot more experience mm-hmm. in terms of how to apply these laws and how we advise our boards of directors and our physician partners to go forward.
To your point earlier about the land grab, the first generation land grabs, that in and of itself changes and shifts market dynamics, local market dynamics, meaning the local supply demand, the local affiliations and referral networks and things like that. So just naturally, there's a natural evolution there within individual markets that I think is impacting what deals look like today or what they're going to look like tomorrow and next year and that type of thing.
And I think when you identify what deals look like today versus what they'll look like tomorrow, or maybe in hindsight what they look like 10 years ago, the employers, the health systems, look much different today than they did 10 years ago. Yeah. So in a lot of states, there was very prevalent to have every community, every county would have its own health or hospital. And I think you're seeing that now. Now there are fewer and fewer local community hospitals, and they're all trying to figure out how do we continue to serve our constituents, be the large employer in town, but also recognize that we need to partner with somebody.
Yeah. And there's new forms of delivery of care that we have to think about. A lot of it is driven in a positive way by technology, such as telemedicine and the whole reimbursement structure and the protocols relative to that. That could be another subject in and of itself for another podcast. But the whole idea of how care is being delivered and the fact that, relatively speaking, only the last 20 years or so has the healthcare industry really gotten into electronic communications, especially with electronic health records and so forth. Here again, that has opened up the whole new avenue for what we're talking about today. So I think we'll continue to see some of that as technology, or maybe healthcare catches up with technology, as we're diligently trying to do.
Yeah. Michael, something you said, we're moving towards $1 billion in penalties. It reminded me because I was with a client not too long ago, a couple weeks ago, talking about a deal across the table with a physician group. One of the physicians makes a comment, or we kind of make that point of defending why these things have to be fair market value, why we're spending so much time on this, and a conversation we regularly have, which rightfully so. But, the response was kind of like, well, yeah, these penalties aren't going to go away because the government has realized how good a revenue source it is as a result of settling these. So most of these deals, or most of these breaches are being settled, from what I understand, outside of, other litigation. And I thought to myself, well, that's a fairly cynical way of looking at it. But then again, I'm fairly realistic about sometimes, what the government can kind of drive in terms of motive. So any thoughts on that, just anecdotally?
I think there are probably different perspectives that you might take in the industry. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got what I'll call bad actors, intentional bad actors. Sure. And while we don't see a lot of those, you do see some of those from time to time. Whether it's in a Stark or anti-kickback analysis, oftentimes an anti-kickback analysis, or whether it's in a HIPAA breach analysis.
Or now with the opioid crisis, they're
right.
really targeting.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You get into a lot of kickback issues associated with that. So you see a lot of bad actors on that end of the spectrum. But I think, going back to what I said a little bit earlier, this is it sounds a little trite, but it's a complex industry. And there are a lot of different regulatory guide rails that you've got to stay within. And I think that makes it difficult even for the best intentioned of our clients. And I think that dovetails back to why you see more and more physician groups make the decision to either be part of a mega group or be employed by a health system. Because quite frankly, when you look at the back office management of a practice, it's incredibly difficult. So you put into those buckets things like regulatory compliance, billing and collecting, HR-related issues. Those alone can take up a tremendous amount of focus, time, energy, and resources if you're talking about a practice that's 5 or 10 providers.
Yeah, good point. As we're continuing to talk a little bit about compensation, and we talk a lot here. We have a whole series on the podcast that we're releasing this year on compensation and some specific components that we focus on as it relates to that broad topic. But obviously, this is a major part of any alignment deal. As we're looking at second generation, though, I know one of the things the two of you talked about in your presentation was kind of this, I guess, a balance between, whether we're talking kind of the economic terms or reimbursement components, the vision or values, as well as incentive structure, which we're going to dive into that a little bit further. Maybe just talk about that in terms of, what are the key things that, from a hospital's perspective, they're really having to focus on in this second generation, and kind of the physician or the investment they're making in this physician partnership for maybe a second time around?
We tend to separate the economic and non-economic terms and conditions, and they're typically and predictably you'll find a gravitation toward the economic terms because obviously that's very important. What we're starting to see in some of these second generation deals, though, that governance and leadership, organizational structure, etc., certainly could have an effect on the economics, or they could, but we're seeing more and more emphasis being placed on that sort of thing. So maybe a quick example, and as such, we are often seen in the renewed deals where the physician group is saying, well, we want to continue the relationship, but we feel like we've got a pretty solid infrastructure in and of ourselves, and we would like to have more independence and authority, albeit still being employed as or under a professional services agreement. We're also finding a lot of hospitals that are seeing a lot of validity in that. So a lot of the second generation deals are taking on a little different form in terms of governance and independence of the group, still under the overall umbrella and auspices of the hospital, the health system. So I think that's one area, Mark. I would say quickly on the economic side, and we've talked about this already some, what we're still seeing in the second, third generation deals, the renewals, is mostly emphasis on productivity. And I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least say that. I always say the sky's not falling on us and we're all of a sudden under fee for value and we've got to figure out a mechanism to compensate that. It's still, most places we go and work, it's still fee for service, and the emphasis is still productivity with appropriate boundaries. So those are just a couple of ideas that I would have in this context of your question, Mark.
And Max, that's a good point. I think in terms of what we're seeing currently, 10, maybe 15% in terms of a focus on compensation tied to quality, if you will. I have read, I've not seen, but I've read in the popular press some arrangements that go to 35, 40% focus on quality as a compensation component, which is impressive if you've drilled down that close on how you measure quality performance. I think in terms of governance issues, that's something that was a big question, certainly in the first generation. And I think what you're seeing in the second generation is an acceptance of that if you have good leadership, whether they're within the hospital or whether they're within your employed physician group, you want to continue that. The challenge from a legal perspective is making clear, and I think, Max, you alluded to this, that it's still going to be under the auspices of and under the employment agreement where the employer, the hospital, is going to ultimately need to have that final thumbs up or thumbs down with regard to moving forward on a certain issue. When we were doing these at the very beginning, these types of arrangements, we called them agreements on policies, procedures, and operations. And it was important to be very clear in terms of what does consultation mean with a particular party? How often do you have to do that? When does the clock begin to tick on that? Those types of things. And you've got to then make sure, while they may look good academically on paper, we can draft something that looks very, very nice. Does it actually work when you put the paper down and you've got to operationalize this sort of thing?
Yeah, it is a good point.
I would just quickly
please.
Interject one
Please.
other point that made me think of this when Michael said that. I think a lot of these deals, we're having to really look closely at how we compensate physicians for administrative time as well. And whether it's typically on a rate per hour basis, so it's tied to the time and the documentation of that, but medical directorships and other co-management agreements and so forth are very much a part of these second generation deals. And to your point, Michael, it seems like they're underwhelming to a lot of physicians, particularly specialists. Let's just be honest here. Cardiologists, orthopedists, neurosurgeons, when they are given their rate per hour, that they're going to be paid relative to a co-management agreement or administrative services agreement, they're underwhelmed. But yet, that's probably what it is. And so I think we're going to have to be very careful from deal-making side, folks like us, and working with attorneys like you, Michael, to stay, on the straight and narrow there within those things, within those components.
And Max, you've hit on co-management and medical director and involving physician leadership in the executive suite, or helping the executive suite push the ball forward. A critical piece is what is being done, identifying on a granular basis what is physician leadership doing, and that can be a very tedious operation, I think, for both the physicians and the health system. And it's certainly working with folks like your team to identify here are the tasks that are going to be accomplished. Mm-hmm. And here's the timeline upon which those tasks need to be accomplished. And for all of that, here's what the compensation will be. And here's how we're going to track and measure that. So if you think about first generation versus second generation, you perhaps saw in the first generation less of a focus on that granularity, but certainly in the second generation, we're all very keyed in on what that granularity means, both from a regulatory perspective and then frankly from an economics perspective, because the buyer needs to make sure, the employer needs to make sure they're getting the benefit of the bargain that they struck with the parties.
That's so true. And not to get too detailed here, but we've seen, and I'm sure you have too, many transactions where, let's just say hypothetically, a particular specialist is offered $225 an hour, and that's not bad. I mean, when you annualize that over a 2,000 hour year, that's pretty good income. But for them, it's underwhelming, and yet it could well be, and probably is, fair market value. And so we have to be very careful as we structure these deals that we follow those guidelines, and yet administrative oversight and work that they're doing is very important to really pull this all together and work as a team between the hospital and the physicians. In other words, it's needed. And yet, I'm not sure we can justify the level of compensation that, let's just say, maybe a orthopedic surgeon would get by going into the OR and doing another total joint.
That's exactly right, Max. And I think that's the challenge, because we can't get to measurement of value for the performance of this the care by the physicians unless we have their involvement. Mm-hmm. And so it's quite a puzzle to be able to put together. But I think it's also one that's important for health systems and physician groups to identify. There are physicians, either current employees or in independent groups, who are very, very good and have a very good skill set in this area. Mm-hmm. That I think it brings a lot of value to the system. And I think it behooves both parties to nurture that and mature that to survive not only for the first 3 years of the arrangement, but also the 5th year. And is there someone else they can train to do that? Mm-hmm. It becomes much more of an executive training program.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
And I know in your presentation, the two of you did, it's actually top 10 lessons learned from second generation deals. And I want to get into those. We're not going to cover each specifically. Before we do that, though, I want to just quickly touch on one topic that at a high level, and I think we'll talk about it more in a subsequent episode. But I feel like we'd be remiss to talk about this subject of renewing first generation deals if we didn't also talk a little bit about the kind of converse route, kind of the other direction, where we are seeing, and I know, Mike, I'm not sure how much you've seen in this area, but I know from CwC's standpoint, we've been involved in a couple of cases of disengagement. So maybe just briefly, let's say, and again, we don't have to, go into grave detail here, but I think it is relevant to just kind of think about if we aren't able to go into a second generation or third generation or whatever, because it has to be on, the consideration has to be out there on the horizon at some point. Talk about what some of those trends, some of the things we've seen as far as disengagement, both from the physician's perspective, from the hospital's perspective, and maybe how can we deal with that? Because, it's inevitably going to be an issue in some cases. Does that make sense?
Sure. I'll comment briefly, Mark. Honestly, most of the transactions get done in the second, third, whatever, subsequent generation. We are seeing some interest and some movement, at least from our perspective, and I certainly want Michael to give his perspective in some areas and some transactions that are not able to be renewed. If that is the case, our premise and point of view and recommendation, no matter who we might be representing, the group or the hospital, as it were, would be to figure out a way to bury hatchets, maybe separate if that's the intention, and let the group have what we have always called a soft landing and continue to figure out ways to work together. So, for example, maybe if the group that's departing from employment has 5 locations, that 4 of those could be leased, the assets, FF&E, could be purchased, obviously at fair market value, and there could be some coordination or even affiliation going forward through a co-management agreement, through a management services agreement. You know, there are plenty of ways for hospitals and physicians to continue to work together, even if, for whatever reason, the employment is not renewed or agreed to not renewed. So I think while, again, we're not seeing a vast, significant number of disengagements, separations, whatever you want to call them, they are happening, and I guess that's our point of view. Michael, legally, what's your thoughts?
I think that you raised a good point in terms of it benefits all parties if there's a coordinated landing. In order to get there, I think that you've got to have leadership from both sides of the table willing to sit down, identify this is going to take 90 days. It's going to take a tremendous amount of work on both sides. And frankly, from the physician group side, unwinding where maybe they didn't have administrative leadership, that is going to be a heavy lift for them.
Very much.
So being able to talk about that ahead of time, put out the time frame for that, understanding that there is no free lunch, and everybody understands that. So desks, tables, chairs, computers, billing system, all of that needs to be purchased. And if it needs to be repurchased from the health system, it needs to be repurchased at fair market value. So lining that up early so there can be an understanding between the parties in terms of what that's going to cost and how to make it happen is a critical piece in making sure the parties unwind in a way that continues to allow them to work together. Because at the end of the day, if the physicians in the hospital have been treating patients in the manner that they want to be treating them, providing good care, hopefully that's not going to change. The patients are still going to be treated at the hospital.
That's
The
right.
doctors still want to be on staff there, still want to do their cases there. It's just perhaps the business arrangement didn't work out. So that doesn't mean that the clinical arrangement needs to end.
Well, and we saw as the first round of these hospital physician deals happened back in the 90s, early 2000s, and there were many that did not separate. Well, there was a lot of, animosity, some baggage, some fallout in a lot of these cases. And there was an impact to that, I believe. And I think we've seen that. And so I think that's the biggest point, I think, of this it's kind of a bummer element of this overall subject, but I do think we have to address it. But I think the biggest point is having some degree of compromise that, it doesn't help our patients, our community, our organizations to go at this like enemies. We can separate adults and ideally come to some sort of reasonable compromise, even if it's not the ideal situation. So.
And the compromise that you come to at the end of this current term may not be the compromise that lasts forever.
Forever, yeah.
It's going to continue to evolve. And so perhaps the parties identify perhaps the best thing to do right now is for us to separate, form an independent group. We want you to continue to provide care here. And let's give it 6 months, get your feet underneath you, and let's maintain that close relationship. And let's decide then what this service line is going to look like. Let's not try to solve everything today.
And we've seen it go the other way too, where some of the alignment evolved similarly, meaning sometimes some of these deals started out with maybe it's a joint venture on a surgery center. Maybe it's, some sort of medical directorship or co-management agreement, and then it evolved into a full PSA or a full employment arrangement. So it's in some cases has evolved slowly, and it can kind of go the other way too, where it doesn't have to just be a full-on overnight disengagement necessarily.
Yeah, I think the elephant in the room, of course, on these separations is the competition and the fear that the group will gravitate to a competitor. And I know that's been something that we've been challenged with on a couple of these that we've been working on as recent as this year. And yet I think, Michael, you made a great point that at the end of that proverbial day, it's still about treating the patient. And I really truly believe that hospitals and physicians do put that at the top of their list. I truly believe that. And so trying to do what's right to treat the patient and work through that is still the overarching point. But it's a very complex situation. I will say this too. I think under a separation, there are many physicians that don't understand and appreciate the cost that they're going to incur and the requirement of the capital. And you alluded to, as did I, on desks and chairs, but there's IT systems, there's myriad other things that maybe if they've been employed for 4, 5, 6 years, they've kind of forgotten about. And now all of a sudden, hey, we've got to figure out a way to pay for this stuff. So I think it's important that if those that are listening that might be thinking about leaving the employment, I would encourage you to do, no matter who you are, hospital or physician, to really rethink that and not jump into that, because maybe it's the right thing ultimately, but there are a lot of let's just say obstacles out there on both sides to undo these relationships. And that's why I think second generation deals are so important to get right, but to stay focused on trying to get them done.
That's good, because that brings us back to our discussion on setting the stage for second generation alignment transactions. Again, as I alluded to earlier, you guys have gone through and you have 10 things here that you outlined. We're not going to go into each one specifically, but I did want to touch on a couple, and obviously people can go and download the full list and the information behind it. But I did want to touch on a couple of these quickly, and some of this we've already really talked through, but one of the ones that jumped out to me was actually the first point. And I think this takes us back to something we alluded to earlier, but it says physician market share does not mean success. So health systems have to become more selective relative to transactions. And it kind of also leads into the idea that, there are some other types of arrangements other than just employment. But maybe just speak to that briefly in terms of what does that mean and what does that look like when you're talking about becoming more selective?
Yeah, I think that the hospital is going to be more focused on where it is they want to be in their strategic plan 5, 6 years from now. And so not every transaction is going to look exactly like what they did before. I think they're going to be more selective in identifying exactly what specialties they want to align with. And I think they also understand that perhaps employment is not the alignment model, is not the end-all be-all. Mm-hmm. Perhaps there are others, and I think we've noted here, a PSA arrangement might provide the flexibility, might still provide the vision and the ability for the system to get where it wants to be from a strategic standpoint. So I think they're being more selective in identifying not only the partners they want to move forward with, but also the types of arrangements that they want to move forward with.
I would add that the old cliched term that's been overused of downstream revenue is not necessarily as downstream and great as maybe we thought it would be. And even from a compliance standpoint, we have to be very careful how we categorize that, and certainly how it's fits into any transaction. But be that as it may, I think the concepts of hospitals looking for some sort of acceptable loss off their employment arrangement is becoming more and more a requirement. And again, I use the term acceptable loss. What I'm suggesting is that I think hospitals still, for the most part, do not show a black bottom line off their employed physician medical groups and so forth. It's probably still in red, and a lot of the reasons for that we won't go into time-wise today, but the ancillaries are pulled out and so on and so forth. So to some extent, that's where the downstream has application. But I will say on these second generation deals, that hospitals are looking at it with much more scrutiny as to, what is going to be the bottom line of this employment or PSA arrangement with this group going forward. We have to have some accountability as it relates to the big picture of all these 200-300 doctors that we employ.
And that's a good point, Max. And I think while there may be losses associated with various specialties, I think the days of acceptable losses being at a very high level and being able to just stick your head in the sand and ignore those are certainly well behind us. And the question that I think both parties need to ask is, as the evolution of the service, the evolution of the relationship moves forward, how are the parties addressing those losses? Certainly, they can't expect those to continue forever. At a certain level, is there a process by which those will be reduced, monitored, managed, versus just written off and not worried about? I think from a compliance standpoint, we absolutely can't just ignore those.
Yeah, great point. One of the other points that was in the kind of top 10 lessons is the, it relates to the infrastructure required. We talked earlier about kind of this slow evolution, slow move towards fee for value or value-based reimbursement. And we talked about things like quality and those types of things. But one of the points relates to infrastructure to support non-productivity incentives. And I guess going back to that discussion a little bit, and Michael, the one you mentioned, maybe up as high as 35 to 40% of compensation tied to, I guess, more value-based metrics, quality-based metrics is definitely, I would say, very high. And I would agree with kind of what you said earlier, where we're seeing still maybe 10 to 15% of those compensation packages. And even then, that can be kind of cause some anxiety for some people. But are you seeing a more focus, particularly from the health system perspective, on creating that infrastructure, developing those protocols, putting the systems in place, and managing those arrangements in such a way that is moving towards at least being more prepared for when that gradually comes? Or are we kind of hoping for the best and we'll believe it when we see it type thing? Does that make sense?
I think they're moving toward that, and people, there's a phrase that I'm reminded of, that people respect what you inspect, and I think that's where we're moving in healthcare, and being able to inspect and measure those quality achievements. I think it's a tremendous challenge for a hospital or a health system that doesn't have actually in place the ability to put pen on paper and track a particular piece of quality for a particular physician in a particular specialty and run that through the comp model. It can be incredibly time consuming, I can imagine, from an operations standpoint.
And it's still, I agree totally, and it's still very subjective, let's face it. And that therein lies a lot of the challenge, because physicians, by nature, I don't think are opposed to being graded, if you will. I mean, look how they went through their training and all the years and the challenges just to get into med school, for example. And I give them all the credit in the world for being at the top of their intellectual class, so to speak, usually. But the mere fact of how we try to quantify and grade them is still somewhat subjective. So I think one of the challenges, Mark, with this particular point of infrastructure and non-productivity based incentives is the credibility that's still lacking. And physicians respectfully question the credibility of the data. And, oh, by the way, you're now going to pay me 15% or 10, maybe 30 is now going to be based on this somewhat perceived nebulous area of quality. So I think we have a ways to go on this. I think the good news is we're all working on it. We're kind of focused on it. The government's helping out, so to speak, with MACRA. And so we'll get there, but I think it'll take a little bit longer, and then we'll see what it looks like at that point. But I think there's still a heck of a lot of infrastructure development before we're there.
Yeah. The last one I wanted to ask you guys about is this point of continuously reassessing comp structures in light of all the different things that are happening, regulatory, industry trends. We talked obviously a lot about value-based, fee for value, MACRA, for instance. My question for that, though, is that happening, and what is kind of the attitude from, and particularly I'm thinking about the physician's perspective here, because where I've seen a lot of the first generation, it was a lot about, hey, the guarantee period. I want to know very specifically what my criteria is. If it's a RVU threshold, then, I know exactly, it's very clear what I'm going after, what the target is. And they want a lock-in period as much as possible. So there's definitive metrics and a definitive timeline, at least to the extent that you can. Are we seeing a change in that attitude or that perspective of, hey, we realize these things are changing, we may need to be a little more fluid, be a little more dynamic? Or is that kind of, whoa, that's, heartburn area as soon as you bring it up?
I think it's still more of a heartburn area because you're talking about people's compensation,
That's right.
which in any industry, it's a very sensitive topic. Everybody wants to know how they're going to be measured, how they're going to be paid. So I think while from a contractual standpoint, easy to draft, easy to roll out, from a in terms of advance notice, providing the details, I think the real important thing is how that message is delivered, and what's the party willing to do if there is an agreement that's reached.
I couldn't agree with you more, Michael. The heartburn, as you put it, Mark, is clearly there, and it's human nature. I mean, okay, so I have a 3-year agreement. Oh, by the way, it has maybe a 90-day without cause termination right, which means you could potentially invoke it and then talk about new compensation as a result of that. You still want to keep it in place, but you're using those means to do it, and that's not received well by the physician, and I think with some justification. So I think we have to be careful about how soon and how quick we try to make these changes in the compensation structure. And with that said, of course, we want to stay in tune with what's going on in the industry. So it's a very delicate balance, and we all have to be aware of it because we are dealing with people's lives and their careers. And compensation is a big part of that, just as it is for each of us with our respective careers. So I think we want to be real careful to not be too quick to make these changes.
I think another thing, Michael, you mentioned it earlier too, here is possibly where a little bit more discussion around governance could come into play as well. And what I've seen in my experience is the more participation you give everybody a seat around the table, give them a voice, give them, whether it's an actual vote or at least the opportunity to provide input, it can go a long way. And to your point about how that's communicated, how this information is delivered, I know there's been a lot of discussion around just wanting transparency, better understanding of what does the data show, so at least they can be familiar with it and you're not just throwing it on them and at this kind of last minute thing that puts somebody back on their heels and it becomes acrimonious from the get-go.
That's a really good point, Mark. I think communication, always beneficial. I think it also requires strong leadership, though, on both sides of the table to know that at some point discussion will have to stop and action will have to be taken. And
you can only talk for so long.
That's right. And one party may not agree with either the resources the other party's brought together, may not agree with the reports that have been pulled together, but action will have to be taken because, again, remember, we're in a highly regulated industry, to put it very lightly, and you can't continue to kick the can down the road with a relationship that is not regulatorily compliant. And that may be one of the reasons why the parties have come to the table.
Great point. And I think that's a great summary in terms of the overarching discussion and topic. And so I as we close out, again, we only kind of grazed the surface on some of the specific content and points related to this topic. So I do want to again reiterate that detailed information on this from this presentation is available. And so if anybody has questions on that, obviously we'll provide information where to contact Max, where to contact Michael, and additional resources. As we close, just any thoughts or kind of overarching recommendations in terms of looking at this subject, Peeper?
I'll lead off with that. Mark, I think the one recommendation, if I can give a high-level view of it, is You've seen one deal, and that sounds a little trite, but the industry continues to evolve, and every situation is a little bit different throughout the country. And I think that both parties, employer and employee, need to keep that in mind, that what may have worked well for somebody 3,000 miles away may not work necessarily well for you.
I would echo that and maybe add a couple just word descriptions of where I think we should go with these second-generation deals. I think, and we've talked about it today, I know Michael said it once or twice, communication is important. An overused, cliched term, but I'm going to use it, transparency is important. I think respect is another thing that we should have as we're working. No matter what side of the fence you might be on, we need to look at this as, we're really partners in this whole effort of delivering health care. And so I think having mutual respect for the other side, if you will, is incredibly important. And I think as advisors, consultants, attorneys, we need to think about what the other side, no matter who we're representing, is perhaps in their perspective on this. And I know, Michael, you do a great job of this when I've worked with you before, and we try to at Coker Group, and let's make our heightened efforts to win maybe not be so much that way, and really look beyond that to try to create second-generation deals that are win-win. And so I think that's really incumbent upon us as advisors and working with physicians and hospitals around the country to do.
Great points. Well, I thought it was a great conversation. I really appreciate, Max, Michael, the input you guys have here, and I know it's a popular topic, so we'll be talking about it more. But again, we'll look forward to future conversation on this, and we thank everybody for listening. We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We'd love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group. And then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.